Hello fellow health-seeking humans. If you're new to my channel, my name is Jake and I like to help patients become their own best health advocates. SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, made me extremely sick because it turns out that if the thing that helps you digest your food isn't working right, that's a problem. So I threw myself into the research to learn about my condition, and I have now maintained SIBO remission for over a year and a half. Can I get a hallelujah? In this video, I'm going to go over some of the newest findings in SIBO and IMO, which stands for intestinal methanogen overgrowth, and make the science more digestible. Pun intended. If you've been following my content for a while, you will know that every time I've mentioned the Trio Smart breath test, I've said hashtag not sponsored, which turned into hashtag still not sponsored. But today is the day I finally get to say hashtag sponsored. I don't want to sound too cheesy, but when I say that this test saved my life, that's literal. The Trio Smart breath test is the only test available that can test for all three gases: hydrogen, methane, and hydrogen sulfide, and that's the one that no other test can capture. Luckily, my GI doctor knew about this test, and I did it almost right after it became available, and my hydrogen sulfide level was 10, which is the highest that the test goes. I may have even broken the machine. Without this test, we wouldn't have known what to treat, which is kind of important, and I really respect that this test was developed by people who have been studying SIBO for over 2 decades. And they have given me a discount code that will get you 10% off. So that code is JAKE10, and I make no money off that code, and if I ever get SIBO again, I'll use my own discount code. Now, into the research. I know that patients have been waiting for a long time to know what are the hydrogen sulfide producers, and we finally have research on that. I do want to say that the info in this video isn't for total newbies. So if you're brand new to SIBO, I have a whole playlist in the video description box below that I've linked to. So this research was presented at Digestive Disease Week, which is basically a conference where a bunch of GI nerds get together. Not sure why I wasn't invited. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm actually very curious to know what they serve at lunch at a GI conference. Like, is it gluten-free and organic? And one time I asked one of my GI doctors what he eats, and he said basically anything with 4 legs except maybe the table. We now know that 2 of the hydrogen sulfide producers are from the categories Fusobacterium and Desulfovibrio. I think patients and doctors were really into knowing which type of bacteria was responsible for H2S SIBO, and that was because they were looking at stool tests, because until relatively recently we didn't have the hydrogen sulfide test available. And even though we now know that these 2 categories of bacteria are associated with H2S SIBO, we still have to be careful with how we interpret that data. Data, potato, potato, but no one says potato. Tomato. No one says that either, do they? So what I mean by that is you can't just look at a stool test and see that Fusobacterium is high and or Desulfovibrio is high and conclude that you definitely have H2S SIBO. And according to Dr. Pimentel, when Fuso is up, it is catastrophically up. And I don't really know what he means by that since he hasn't published on that, and neither has anyone else. You would need a study showing what level of Fusobacterium is correlated with H2S SIBO and how that's correlated with diarrhea. Hopefully one day we will have that data. Tomato. And to drive that point home a little bit more, we can look at what is going on with IMO. It's much better to face these kinds of things with a sense of poison rationality. I chime in. Haven't you people ever heard of? No, not that type of IMO, intestinal methanogen overgrowth, which, just as a reminder, is the new name for what used to be known as the methane SIBO. The new name is because the microbes that create methane are not bacteria, they're actually archaea, which is another type of single-celled organism. So you get rid of the B and you add in the M for methanogens, and then you get rid of the S because it's not found only in the small intestine, it's also found in the colon. Get it? So they recently did a study where they looked at the stool and the juice from the small intestine from 14 people. And obviously that's not a lot of people, but it's 14 more people than anyone else in the world is doing. And they looked all throughout the GI tract, so the duodenum or the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, the jejunum, which is the second part of the small intestine, and then the farthest distance that they could reach in the small intestine, and the stool. And what they found was that the composition of methanogens, or the percentage of the different types of the methanogens, Maganafins. I like Maganafins, that one's my favorite. And what they found was that the composition of methanogens in each part of the small intestine and the stool was different, or the percentage, as you can see in this chart. Another thing that they found is that half of the participants didn't have any methanogens in their stool whatsoever. So if you're looking at stool to find IMO, you may really be missing something. And according to Dr. Pimentel, they are doing a similar study but with hydrogen sulfide producers so that they can figure out which microbes are the hydrogen sulfide producers, where they're located, and in what percentage or concentration. And Dr. Pimentel has said that this data should be available in the coming months. One thing I want to point out about these studies is that they use patients that fit perfect narrow definitions of patients with IBS-C or IBS-D. When I had IMO, I didn't have constipation. And when I had H2S SIBO, I didn't have diarrhea. So I'm not invited to the conferences, and I'm not invited to the studies either. My symptoms included horrendously painful belching, bloating, and heightened MCAS because I have MCAS. And of course, I'm just telling you an anecdote about myself, which isn't science, but I am curious to see if and how these correlations will hold up in patients that have SIBO that aren't perfect IBS patients or don't really present with IBS at all. So now I want to refer to the rabbits and foxes and wolves metaphor that I've talked about many times on my channel. In this metaphor from Dr. Pimentel, the rabbits are the microbes that make the hydrogen, and the foxes and the wolves are the microbes that make the methane and the hydrogen sulfide. This is because the foxes and wolves both eat the rabbits, aka the microbes that make hydrogen sulfide and the microbes that make methane both eat hydrogen as fuel. But really, those microbes don't eat the other microbes, they eat the gas from the microbes, so it's more like the foxes and wolves are eating the gas or the farts from the rabbits. But this metaphor isn't really as accurate anymore now that we have new info. We used to think that the foxes and wolves competed for the same rabbits, and this is why if you had hydrogen sulfide SIBO, you were less likely to have IMO, and vice versa. So now the picture's a bit different. It appears that the foxes and wolves don't actually eat the same rabbits. Okay, time to get out of the metaphor for a second. So we now know that E. coli and Klebsiella are correlated with the hydrogen sulfide producers of Fusobacterium and Desulfovibrio. And the methanogens in IMO don't use the hydrogen produced by the E. coli and Klebsiella. Instead, they get their hydrogen from different types of bacteria, which are Christensenolaceae and Ruminococcaceae. So maybe a better metaphor is the food that we eat is the grass, and the mice and the rabbits eat the grass, and the foxes eat the mice, and the wolves eat the rabbits. And usually one side, whether that be the mice and the foxes or the rabbits and the wolves, wins out. This seems to be a somewhat okay metaphor for now, but it will probably change as we get more research. So how does this new info change treatment? Well, it seems like it doesn't, at least not yet. According to Dr. Pimentel, this is how their clinic is still doing it. If you have hydrogen SIBO, they use rifaximin. H2S SIBO is rifaximin and bismuth, and IMO is rifaximin and neomycin. And if you can't get neomycin, then they trade that out for metronidazole. And it's worth noting that the antibiotics that we use for IMO were developed for bacteria and not necessarily for archaea. We don't know if they're killing the bacteria that feed the methanogens and or they have activity against the methanogens themselves, but the cedar-cyanide team is working on all of that. Recently, when asked about biofilms, Dr. Pimentel said, quote, "We're going to give you some more data later this year on trying to get to where E. coli and Klebsiella reside in a special way. So we hope that it would be more effective, so stay tuned." So I've already told you on my channel that I treated my H2S SIBO with rifaximin and NAC as a mucolytic or biofilm agent, and I got that idea by looking on clinicaltrials.gov and finding Pimentel's clinical trial. Once again, this is just my anecdote, and it is definitely not medical advice, but you have to admit I'm a stellar sleuth, which is what you have to be when you're trying not to die. And another interesting finding that was published recently is on SIBO and cytokines. Until the pandemic, the word cytokine was probably not known to many people, but now, thanks to COVID, most people have heard of a cytokine storm. Cytokines are basically inflammatory molecules, they're proteins that immune cells release when they're trying to lodge an attack against a pathogen. But they're also involved in autoimmunity when the body's cytokine signaling system gets dysregulated. We now know that certain cytokines are elevated in those that have SIBO. And these are also cytokines that are elevated in autoimmunity, and we know that SIBO has an autoimmunity component to it. And so to get up to speed on all of that, if you're not, I'll leave a link in the video description box. What I think is very interesting about this study is that they measured the cytokines in the duodenal fluid. For so many illnesses, we test for pathogens or inflammatory mediators like cytokines in tissues or bodily fluids that are easy to get access to, like blood. Duodenal fluid, on the other hand, is not easy to access, but it makes so much more sense to measure inflammation at the site of inflammation instead of peripheral blood. It's very easy for doctors to measure your blood and see no signs of inflammation, and if they're not rude, they'll say something like, I don't know what's wrong with you, and if they are rude, they might say you're psychosomatic. So it's really important for patients to know that your regular labs might not show any signs of inflammation, but that doesn't mean that you don't have inflammation. It just means that you have inflammation that is not detected by routine lab workups. Another interesting finding to come from this study is that the authors say that cytokines can actually disrupt motility, which is one of the main parts of the pathophysiology of SIBO. So it's basically like a vicious cycle feeding into itself. So I don't know if targeting cytokines in some way will be a part of therapy for SIBO in the future, but I do know that researchers are looking into that side for COVID, and maybe it could get translated over to other conditions as well in the future. Also, just between you and me and the rest of the internet, I might have a very exciting video coming up, but I don't want to tell you what it is until it's in the bag. You're a bunny. But no, I don't let wolves eat you. I put all of my best SIBO videos on a playlist right here, so just click right there and Piper and I will see you over there. You better click or else I'm gonna start singing. The sense of poison rationality. Would you prefer a lullaby? That mockingbird don't sing. Mama's gonna buy you a diamond ring. Do you like that better?